April 12, 1945, Okinawa. Lieutenant James Parker's hands gripped the control stick of his F4U Corsair as the island's southern cliffs materialized through the morning haze. Below him, a concrete bunker complex sprawled across the ridgeline like a cancerous growth, its firing ports already spitting tracers at the Marine infantry pinned on the beach. He had made this run 17 times in the past 9 days, strafing with his .650 caliber machine guns, watching the bullets spark harmlessly off reinforced concrete while good men died in the sand below. But today was different. Today, beneath his wings hung 8 5-inch high-velocity aircraft rockets, weapons that nobody, not the Japanese defenders, not his own command staff, and certainly not Parker himself, truly believed would work against fortified positions. The Navy had promised these rockets would crack bunkers open like eggshells. Parker was about to discover they were catastrophically wrong about what these weapons could actually do. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. What Lieutenant James Parker didn't know as he rolled into his attack dive that morning was that he was about to participate in the birth of modern close air support doctrine, a transformation so complete that it would redefine how nations conceived of infantry support for the next 8 decades. The mathematics of his situation told a grim story. Across Okinawa's hostile terrain, Japanese engineers had constructed over 4,800 fortified positions, concrete and steel bunkers dug so deep into coral limestone that conventional naval bombardment had proven almost useless. The pre-invasion shelling had expended over 44,000 rounds of naval artillery with results that shocked American planners. Reconnaissance photos taken after the bombardment showed bunkers that looked untouched, their firing slits still aligned perfectly toward the beaches where Marines would land. The coral rock absorbed explosive force like a sponge, and the Japanese had learned from their defeats on earlier islands to build deeper, stronger, and more cunningly concealed than anyone had anticipated. Parker had grown up in rural Montana, learning to fly crop dusters over wheat fields before the war had pulled him into naval aviation training. His hands knew aircraft the way a concert pianist knew keys, through thousands of hours of muscle memory that transformed conscious thought into instinctive reaction. But nothing in his training had prepared him for the absolute futility of watching his bullets accomplish nothing while men died below. The Corsair was supposed to be the ultimate fighter, its massive Pratt & Whitney engine generating 2,000 horsepower, its inverted gull wings giving it a distinctive silhouette that struck fear into Japanese pilots. In air-to-air combat, Parker had scored 3 confirmed kills, turning the Corsair's speed and firepower into decisive advantages. But against concrete fortifications, the magnificent fighter had become just another expensive way to make noise. The high-velocity aircraft rockets represented desperation disguised as innovation. Naval ordnance officers had watched too many assault waves get cut down by bunkers that shrugged off everything thrown at them. The rockets had been developed originally for anti-shipping strikes, their 5-inch diameter warheads designed to punch through destroyer hulls. Someone in the Bureau of Ordnance had suggested that what penetrated steel might also crack concrete, a theory that sounded plausible in Washington conference rooms but had never been tested against actual Japanese fortifications. The rockets were temperamental weapons, prone to guidance failures and premature detonations. Their accuracy was questionable at best, and their blast radius remained largely theoretical. Parker's squadron had received exactly 40 minutes of training on rocket deployment before being ordered to use them in combat. The morning briefing had been conducted by Commander Robert Walsh, a career Navy officer whose previous experience with close air support consisted entirely of reading technical manuals. Walsh had stood before a map of Okinawa's southern approaches, his pointer tapping at red circles that marked known bunker complexes, and explained the rocket attack profile with confidence that none of the pilots shared. Each Corsair would carry 8 rockets, approaching the target in a 30-degree dive, releasing at 1,500 feet altitude, then pulling out hard to avoid ground fire. The commander's calculations suggested that even with 50% accuracy, the rockets would deliver enough explosive force to neutralize bunker positions. What Walsh didn't mention, because he genuinely didn't know, was that his calculations were based on impact against vertical surfaces, not the sloped armor that Japanese engineers had specifically designed to deflect projectiles. Parker's wingman was Lieutenant Theodore Kowalski, a former mechanic from Detroit whose understanding of aircraft systems exceeded that of most engineers. Kowalski had expressed his doubts about the rockets during the pre-flight inspection, pointing out the improvised nature of the launch rails and the concerning flexibility in the mounting brackets. The rockets had been designed for different aircraft and adapted to the Corsair through modifications that looked more like field expedients than proper engineering. Each rocket weighed 140 pounds, and their weight distribution changed the Corsair's flight characteristics in ways that the brief training session had not adequately addressed. Parker trusted Kowalski's mechanical instincts more than he trusted Commander Walsh's mathematical theories, but orders were orders, and Marines were dying while they debated rocket reliability. The flight deck of the USS Bunker Hill had been organized chaos that morning, with ordnance crews loading rockets while aircraft handlers positioned Corsairs for launch. The carriers were operating dangerously close to shore, close enough that Japanese artillery could theoretically reach them, or risk accepted because the Corsairs needed maximum fuel for extended loiter time over the battlefield. Parker had watched the ordnance chief personally inspect each rocket, checking electrical connections and safety pins with the careful attention of a man who knew that sloppy work killed pilots. The chief was a grizzled veteran who had been loading aircraft weapons since the Battle of Midway, and even he had expressed reservations about the rockets. His exact words, delivered in a growl that barely qualified as regulation conversation, had been that the rockets were either going to win the war or blow them all to hell, and he wasn't taking bets on which. The weather that morning had been perfect for close air support, clear skies with unlimited visibility and winds calm enough to allow precise approach angles. Parker had launched forth in the 6-plane strike package, feeling the Corsair's sluggish response to control inputs as the rocket's weight dragged at the wings. The climb to altitude had taken longer than normal, the overloaded fighters struggling to reach the 8,000 feet that would give them room to maneuver during the attack dive. Below them, the island of Okinawa stretched like a detailed model, its southern beaches crawling with tiny figures that Parker knew were Marines advancing against fortified positions. Naval gunfire was still pounding the ridgelines, massive explosions that looked devastating from altitude but which Parker knew from bitter experience accomplished almost nothing against properly constructed bunkers. The radio chatter told the story of desperation in clipped military phrases that concealed human anguish. Marine forward observers were calling for any support available, their voices tight with the controlled panic of men watching their units get shredded by interlocking fields of fire. The bunker complex that Parker's flight was assigned to attack had been designated Target Alpha 7, a cluster of 12 interconnected positions that commanded the approaches to a critical road junction. 2 previous attempts by Marine engineers to assault the position with satchel charges had failed catastrophically, with the demolition teams cut down before they could get within throwing distance. The bunkers had been constructed with overlapping fields of fire, each position covering its neighbors in a defensive network that made individual assault virtually suicidal. Parker began his attack run with the textbook precision drilled into him through hundreds of training flights, rolling the Corsair into a 30-degree dive that lined up the target in his gun sight. The bunker complex grew larger in his windscreen, its concrete structures now visible as distinct rectangular shapes with the characteristic dark shadows of firing ports. At 3,000 feet altitude he could see muzzle flashes from Japanese machine guns, tracers that arced lazily upward before accelerating past his canopy with startling speed. The Corsair's armor plating was concentrated around the cockpit and engine, but rockets hanging beneath the wings were vulnerable to any hit that might detonate their warheads prematurely. Parker focused on his airspeed indicator, keeping the needle steady at 280 knots as the altimeter unwound through 2,000 feet. The release point approached with geometric precision, altitude and angle combining to reach the calculated moment when Parker's thumb found the rocket release button. The first pair of rockets left their rails with a whoosh that shook the entire aircraft, trailing white smoke as they accelerated ahead of the diving Corsair. Parker's eyes tracked their flight path, watching the rockets arc slightly downward toward the target bunker. The warheads impacted with explosions that seemed disappointingly small from his altitude, white flashes against gray concrete that vanished almost immediately. He fired the second pair of rockets, then the third, walking his impacts across the bunker complex as he had been trained. The fourth pair launched just as he pulled back on the stick to begin his recovery, G-forces pressing him into his seat as the Corsair's nose came up and the island surface fell away below him. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. What Parker saw as he climbed back to altitude made his breath catch in his throat. The bunker he had targeted was gone. Not damaged, not partially destroyed, but completely obliterated. Where reinforced concrete had stood moments before, there was now a crater filled with smoke and debris. The surrounding bunkers were damaged as well, their walls cracked and collapsed from blast effects that had propagated through the interconnected tunnel system. Japanese soldiers were visible scrambling from the wreckage, tiny figures running for secondary positions. Parker's rockets had done in 30 seconds what weeks of naval bombardment had failed to accomplish. The weapons that everyone had doubted, the improvised system that looked like it might kill more Americans than Japanese, had just proved catastrophically effective. Commander Walsh's voice crackled over the radio, demanding confirmation of what reconnaissance aircraft were reporting. Parker struggled to find words adequate to describe what he had witnessed, settling finally for a simple statement that Target Alpha 7 was destroyed and that the rockets had exceeded all expectations. He could hear the disbelief in Walsh's response, the commander clearly assuming that Parker was either mistaken or exaggerating the results. The standing orders were to make one attack pass and then return to the carrier, but Parker made a decision that violated protocol and probably saved dozens of Marine lives. He requested permission to make a second attack run against adjacent bunker positions, using his remaining ammunition to exploit the chaos his first attack had created. The second pass revealed details that Parker's first attack had been too fast to observe. The rockets weren't just destroying bunkers through direct impact. The warheads were penetrating into the tunnel systems that connected the fortified positions, detonating inside the complexes and causing structural failures that collapsed entire networks of defensive positions. Japanese engineers had built their bunkers to withstand external explosions, but they had created vulnerability by connecting everything underground. Parker's rockets were turning the defensive network into a death trap, with blast waves propagating through tunnels and causing failures far from the impact points. The high-velocity aircraft rockets had found the one weakness in fortifications that had been specifically designed to resist conventional bombardment. Lieutenant Kowalski followed Parker's second attack with his own rocket run, and the results were equally devastating. The entire southern section of the bunker complex disintegrated under the assault, massive chunks of concrete tumbling down the hillside as internal structures failed. Marine infantry who had been pinned on the beach for hours suddenly found themselves advancing against positions that were no longer firing. The breakthrough was visible even from Parker's altitude, tiny khaki figures moving forward in organized waves rather than hugging the sand in desperation. Radio traffic exploded with excited chatter as forward observers reported that defensive fire had ceased across a 400-yard front. Target Alpha 7, which had been estimated to require 3 days of sustained assault to neutralize, had been eliminated in under 10 minutes. The flight back to the USS Bunker Hill gave Parker time to process what had just occurred. His hands were still shaking slightly from adrenaline as he joined the landing pattern, the Corsair feeling noticeably lighter without the rocket's weight. The carrier's deck crew were already preparing to rearm and refuel his aircraft for an immediate second mission, word having reached the ship that the rockets had proved effective beyond anyone's projections. Parker's wheels touched down on the carrier deck with the controlled crash that defined carrier landings, his tailhook snagging the arresting wire and bringing the fighter to a halt in less than 300 feet. He secured the engine and climbed from the cockpit into organized chaos as officers surrounded him demanding details about the rocket attack. Commander Walsh arrived within minutes, his previous skepticism replaced by intense interest in every aspect of the weapon deployment. Parker described the attack profile, the rocket performance, and most importantly the unexpected effectiveness against interconnected bunker systems. Walsh was already making notes, calculating how many rockets the carrier air group could deploy and how quickly additional munitions could be brought forward from supply ships. The mathematics of warfare had shifted in a single morning. If rockets could neutralize bunkers that had been considered nearly impregnable, then the entire campaign for Okinawa's southern region might be compressed from months into weeks. The intelligence officers wanted every detail Parker could remember about the bunker construction, the blast patterns, and the Japanese response to the attack. Their questions revealed that American command had fundamentally misunderstood how effective the bunker networks actually were until rockets had exposed their critical vulnerability. The tunnel connections that made the complexes so formidable for infantry assault became fatal weaknesses when explosives penetrated into the interior spaces. Parker found himself sketching diagrams on a ready-room chalkboard, explaining how the blast waves had propagated and caused cascading failures across multiple positions. His crop duster background had given him an intuitive understanding of how structures failed under stress, knowledge that was now being urgently documented for tactical application. The afternoon missions launched with every available Corsair loaded with rockets, the entire carrier air group committed to exploiting the breakthrough that Parker's flight had achieved. The ordnance crews worked with frantic efficiency, loading rockets onto aircraft as quickly as fighters could be refueled and positioned for launch. The USS Bunker Hill's flight deck became a conveyor belt of armed Corsairs, each one carrying 8 rockets toward bunker complexes that Japanese engineers had thought were invulnerable. Parker flew 3 more missions that day, each one targeting different defensive positions, watching the same devastating results repeat with mechanical precision. By evening, the southern bunker network that had stalled the Marine advance for over a week had been reduced to rubble, its defenders either dead or retreating towards secondary positions. The transformation in Marine casualties told the story more clearly than any after-action report. Units that had been suffering 70% casualties during frontal assaults against bunkers suddenly found themselves advancing with minimal losses once rocket strikes had neutralized the fortified positions. The mathematics of infantry warfare had changed overnight. Where previously it had taken hundreds of men and days of brutal combat to eliminate a single bunker complex, now a single Corsair with 8 rockets could accomplish the same mission in minutes. The cost-benefit analysis was staggering. Each rocket cost approximately $500, meaning that 8 rockets totaling $4,000 could replace infantry assaults that might have cost dozens of lives in weeks of time. Parker's ready room became an impromptu classroom that evening as pilots who hadn't participated in the morning missions demanded information about rocket deployment techniques. The brief training session they had received was clearly inadequate for the weapon's potential, and Parker found himself explaining attack angles, release points, and targeting priorities based on his day's experience. Lieutenant Kowalski contributed technical insights about the rocket's flight characteristics and the importance of proper release timing. Together they were developing tactical doctrine in real time, learning through combat application what should have been tested through months of peacetime experimentation. The Japanese response to the rocket attacks revealed how completely the weapons had surprised them. Radio intercepts translated by intelligence officers showed confusion and near panic among Japanese commanders who had believed their bunker networks were immune to air attack. The intercepts described explosions that penetrated deep into fortified positions, causing collapses that buried entire units. Japanese engineers had spent months constructing defensive networks that American rockets were destroying in minutes, and there was no defensive measure they could implement quickly enough to counter the new threat. The psychological impact was as devastating as the physical destruction, with Japanese units abandoning fortified positions that might have held for weeks if the defenders had believed they were secure. The carrier's intelligence office compiled damage assessments through the evening, using reconnaissance photos and marine ground reports to calculate the rocket's effectiveness. The numbers were almost difficult to believe. In a single day, rocket-armed Corsairs had destroyed or damaged over 200 fortified positions, more than had been eliminated in the previous 2 weeks of conventional bombardment and infantry assault combined. The breakthrough had created opportunities for Marine advances that would have been impossible without the rocket attacks. Entire defensive lines that Japanese planners had expected to hold for months were collapsing after days of rocket bombardment. The campaign's timeline was being rewritten in real time as commanders realized that fortifications were no longer the insurmountable obstacles they had been on previous islands. Parker's personal transformation mirrored the tactical revolution he had helped initiate. He had launched that morning expecting another frustrating mission, watching his weapons accomplish nothing against concrete fortifications. He returned having discovered that he possessed the capability to provide meaningful support to infantry in desperate circumstances. The psychological burden of helplessness had been replaced by the knowledge that his skills and weapons could save lives below. This wasn't the romantic aerial combat of fighter duels that had drawn him to naval aviation. This was grimmer, more immediate work, watching men advance because his rockets had eliminated the positions that would have killed them. The emotional weight was different but no less significant. The evening briefing conducted by Commander Walsh outlined plans for the next day's operations with enthusiasm that bordered on euphoria. The success of the rocket attacks had opened tactical possibilities that hadn't existed 24 hours earlier. Walsh's planning now included coordinated strikes where rocket-armed Corsairs would neutralize bunkers immediately before marine assaults, a level of air-ground integration that had been theoretically possible but practically unrealized before the rockets proved effective. The commander's confidence in the weapons was absolute, his earlier skepticism forgotten in the face of overwhelming results. Parker listened to the ambitious plans with mixed feelings, recognizing both the genuine opportunity and the danger of overconfidence in weapons that were still imperfectly understood. Lieutenant Kowalski raised the question that Parker had been considering throughout the afternoon. The rockets had worked spectacularly against Okinawa's bunker networks, but what about different types of fortifications or different terrain? The weapon's effectiveness had been amplified by the interconnected tunnel systems that Japanese engineers had created. Against isolated bunkers or different defensive layouts, would the rockets prove as devastating? Walsh dismissed the concerns with the certainty of an officer who had just witnessed a miracle and wasn't interested in complications. The rockets worked, Marines were advancing, and that was sufficient for immediate tactical purposes. Longer-term questions about the weapon's limitations could be addressed after Okinawa was secured. The night brought little rest for Parker or any of the pilots involved in the rocket attacks. They were scheduled for dawn launches, continuing the bombardment of Japanese defensive positions before Marine infantry renewed their advance. Parker lay in his bunk reviewing the day's missions in his mind, analyzing what had worked and what had been fortune rather than skill. The rockets' accuracy remained questionable, with several missing their targets entirely and exploding harmlessly in unoccupied terrain. The weapon's temperamental nature meant that premature detonations or guidance failures were constant possibilities. But when the rockets functioned as designed and struck their targets, the results exceeded anything Parker had witnessed in 2 years of combat aviation. The mathematics of the rocket attacks revealed efficiencies that would reshape close air support doctrine for generations. A single Corsair could carry 8 rockets, meaning that a 4-plane division could deliver 32 rockets against a target area. Each rocket carried a 40-pound warhead, giving the division 1,280 pounds of explosive force delivered with precision that naval gunfire couldn't match. The Corsairs could remain on station for extended periods, attacking targets as they were identified rather than firing blind bombardments. The cost in aircraft time and pilot risk was significant, but compared to the casualties prevented by eliminating bunkers before infantry assault, the exchange was overwhelmingly favorable. Parker's experience as a crop duster informed his approach to rocket attacks in ways that formal military training hadn't anticipated. Agricultural aviation required precision flying at low altitude, threading between obstacles and placing chemicals exactly where they were needed. The skills translated directly to rocket deployment, where approach angles and release timing determined whether warheads struck fortifications or wasted explosive force on empty ground. Parker's instinctive understanding of how aircraft responded to control inputs at different speeds and attitudes gave him advantages that more conventionally trained pilots lacked. He could feel through the control stick when the Corsair was properly aligned, making minute corrections that kept rockets on target even as ground fire buffeted the aircraft. The carrier's ready room had become an informal research center where pilots shared observations about rocket performance and debated optimal attack techniques. Someone had started a notebook documenting successful strikes, recording altitude, airspeed, release angle, and results for each rocket attack. The informal data collection would eventually form the basis for official tactical manuals, but in April 1945 it was simply pilots trying to not die while figuring out how to use weapons that hadn't existed in operational form weeks earlier. The discussions revealed the creative problem-solving that occurred when intelligent men were given effective tools and permission to experiment with their application. Lieutenant Marcus Chen, a naval aviator who had joined the squadron 2 months earlier, contributed insights from his engineering education about the rocket's penetration mechanics. Chen had studied mechanical engineering at MIT before the war and understood structural dynamics in ways that helped explain why the rockets were so effective against bunkers. The warheads were designed for armor penetration, using shaped charges that focused explosive force into a narrow jet that could pierce steel plating. When those same warheads struck concrete fortifications, they created entry holes that allowed the explosive force to detonate inside the structure rather than against its exterior surface. The bunker's strength against external blasts became a liability once the rockets breached their walls. The second day of rocket operations began with weather that was less cooperative than the previous morning. Cloud cover obscured parts of the target area, and shifting winds complicated approach angles. Parker launched as part of a 12-plane strike against a major defensive complex that intelligence had designated as the key to breaking through Japanese lines in the southern sector. The bunkers were larger than those he had attacked the previous day, with walls estimated at 4 feet thick and overhead cover designed to withstand direct hits from battleship shells. The Marine ground commander had stated flatly that his units couldn't take the position without air support that could crack the fortifications open. The attack run developed differently than Parker's previous missions, with Japanese anti-aircraft fire significantly heavier than he had encountered before. The defenders had clearly learned from the previous day's losses and were committing more resources to shooting down rocket-armed Corsairs. Tracers filled the air as Parker rolled into his dive, and he heard impacts on his aircraft as shrapnel from flak bursts peppered the Corsair's wings and fuselage. The armor plating around the cockpit stopped anything that might have hit him directly, but the vulnerability of having 8 rockets hanging beneath his wings while flying through concentrated fire was impossible to ignore. Parker held his dive angle steady, releasing his first pair of rockets at 1,800 feet altitude, higher than ideal but necessary to clear the worst of the ground fire. The rockets impacted the main bunker with results that exceeded even the previous day's successes. The fortification literally disintegrated, its thick concrete walls shattering as the shaped charge warheads penetrated deep into the structure before detonating. Secondary explosions erupted from the wreckage as stored ammunition cooked off, sending flames and debris hundreds of feet into the air. Parker's remaining rockets targeted adjacent bunkers, each strike producing similar devastating results. By the time he pulled out of his attack dive, the defensive complex that Marine intelligence had estimated would require a week to neutralize was effectively destroyed. The entire attack had taken less than 90 seconds from Roland to pull out. Lieutenant Kowalski's Corsair was hit during his attack run, a lucky shot from a Japanese 25mm anti-aircraft gun that punched through the engine cowling and damaged cylinders. Parker watched his wingman's prop start throwing oil as Kowalski completed his rocket attack and began the climb back toward the carrier. The damaged Corsair was losing power, unable to maintain altitude with the rest of the formation. Parker called for emergency preparation on the USS Bunker Hill while staying with Kowalski as the crippled fighter descended toward the ocean. The mathematics of range versus fuel consumption said Kowalski might not make it back to the carrier, and Parker wasn't going to let his wingman ditch alone if it came to that. Kowalski's voice over the radio was steady despite his aircraft's deteriorating condition, calling out decreasing power levels and falling airspeed as the damaged engine slowly expired. Parker flew close formation, monitoring the crippled Corsair's descent and providing navigation guidance that would keep them on course for the carrier. The ocean below was unforgiving, cold water that would kill a downed pilot quickly if rescue forces couldn't reach him. Destroyer escorts were already moving toward their position, but recovering a pilot from the water took time that hypothermia wouldn't allow. Everything depended on whether Kowalski's damaged engine could keep producing minimal power for another 30 miles. The carrier appeared on the horizon with Kowalski's Corsair barely maintaining flight, its prop windmilling slowly as the engine finally quit completely. Kowalski had altitude and airspeed, enough to glide to the carrier if he managed his energy perfectly. Parker called out airspeeds and distances, coaching his wingman through the dead stick approach while the carrier turned into the wind to provide maximum relative velocity for landing. The landing signal officer on the carrier's deck watched the crippled Corsair approach, his paddles providing guidance that Kowalski followed with precision that spoke to his exceptional skill. The wheels touched down harder than normal as the powerless fighter dropped onto the deck, the tailhook catching the arresting wire and dragging the dead aircraft to a stop. Parker landed minutes later, taxiing to the parking area and securing his engine before jumping from the cockpit to check on Kowalski. His wingman was already out of his aircraft, conducting a damage inspection that revealed how close the anti-aircraft fire had come to catastrophic results. The shell that struck the engine had missed the rocket firing circuit by inches. A slightly different impact point would have detonated the rockets while they were still mounted beneath the wings, destroying the aircraft and killing Kowalski instantly. The narrow margin between mission success and violent death was something both pilots understood intellectually, but seeing the physical evidence drove home how much luck factored into survival. Commander Walsh's briefing that afternoon addressed the increasing Japanese anti-aircraft threat with tactical modifications designed to reduce pilot exposure. The rockets' effectiveness had made them a priority target for Japanese air defense units, with increasing numbers of anti-aircraft guns being moved to protect bunker complexes that had previously seemed invulnerable to air attack. Walsh outlined new approach angles designed to minimize time spent in anti-aircraft range and coordinated strikes where multiple Corsairs attacked simultaneously to overwhelm defensive fire. The commander's plans reflected growing sophistication in rocket employment, learning through combat experience to maximize weapon effectiveness while managing pilot risk. The afternoon missions revealed the full scope of how rocket attacks were transforming the Okinawa campaign. Marine units that had been stalled for days were suddenly advancing miles per day as bunker networks collapsed under rocket bombardment. Japanese defensive lines that had been carefully constructed over months were disintegrating in hours. Intelligence reports indicated that Japanese commanders were ordering retreats from positions that might have held indefinitely without the rocket threat. The psychological impact was as significant as the physical destruction, with Japanese units abandoning fortifications because they believed the bunkers offered no protection against American air power. Parker flew 4 missions that second day, each one targeting different defensive complexes across Okinawa's southern region. The cumulative effect of sustained rocket attacks was visible from altitude as smoke columns marked destroyed bunkers across miles of terrain. By evening, intelligence estimated that over 60% of identified Japanese fortified positions in the assault sector had been destroyed or damaged beyond combat effectiveness. The mathematics of the campaign had shifted decisively. What military planners had estimated would require 2 months of bloody fighting was being accomplished in less than 2 weeks through the systematic application of rocket-armed close air support. The evening found Parker exhausted but unable to sleep, his mind replaying the day's missions in obsessive detail. He had watched men advance because his rockets had destroyed the positions that would have killed them. The direct connection between his actions and lives saved created emotional weight that aerial combat against enemy fighters had never produced. In fighter duels, the enemy was another pilot with comparable skills and equipment. In rocket attacks against bunkers, Parker was protecting infantry who had no defense except his ability to destroy fortifications before they advanced. The responsibility was crushing and exhilarating simultaneously. Lieutenant Chen joined Parker in the carrier's wardroom late that evening, both men too wired for sleep despite their physical exhaustion. Chen had been analyzing gun camera footage from the day's rocket attacks, freeze-framing the moments of impact to study exactly how the warheads penetrated bunker walls. His engineering background provided insights that explained why some attacks produced spectacular results while others seemed less effective. The angle of impact mattered enormously, with near-perpendicular strikes achieving maximum penetration while glancing hits expended much of their force on the fortification's exterior. Chen's analysis would inform the next day's attack profiles, incrementally improving their techniques through systematic observation and adjustment. The transformation occurring across the carrier air group was visible in how pilots approached their missions. The previous month had been characterized by frustration as aviators struggled to provide meaningful support against fortifications that shrugged off their weapons. Now there was purposeful energy as pilots recognized that they possessed tools equal to the challenges they faced. The rocket attacks had restored confidence that had been eroded by weeks of ineffective strikes. Pilots who had been questioning whether close air support was possible against prepared fortifications now discussed tactics for maximizing rocket effectiveness with the enthusiasm of craftsmen who had discovered superior tools. The third day brought weather that grounded most air operations, with heavy rain and low clouds making visual bombing impossible. Parker used the forced rest to work with Chen and other pilots on documenting what they had learned about rocket attacks. Their informal notes were evolving into a tactical manual that would eventually be distributed throughout naval aviation. The document covered everything from optimal approach angles to coordination with forward observers, from rocket reliability issues to techniques for attacking different bunker configurations. What they were creating through trial and error would become foundational doctrine for close air support operations that continued into the 21st century. Commander Walsh visited the ready room that afternoon with news that would reshape how the Navy thought about air-to-ground weapons. Bureau of Ordnance representatives were already requesting detailed reports about rocket effectiveness, with plans to dramatically increase production and distribution across the Pacific theater. The rockets that had been considered experimental weapons just days earlier were now being prioritized for manufacturing. Walsh's briefing included preliminary plans for dedicated rocket-armed squadrons and specialized training programs. The improvised learning that Parker's squadron had conducted through combat trial was going to be systematized and spread throughout naval aviation. The intelligence updates that evening revealed the full strategic impact of the rocket attacks. Japanese defensive preparations across Okinawa had been based on the assumption that bunker networks would slow American advances for months, buying time for Japan to prepare defenses of the home islands. The rocket attacks had collapsed that timeline, with Marine forces advancing weeks ahead of Japanese expectations. Enemy commanders were requesting permission to abandon fortified positions and retreat to secondary defensive lines, acknowledgments that the bunkers could no longer be held against concentrated rocket bombardment. The weapons that nobody had believed would work had changed the mathematical foundations of the entire campaign. Parker's fourth day of rocket operations began with clear skies and a target list that included some of the most heavily fortified positions on Okinawa. Japanese engineers had learned from earlier losses and were attempting to modify bunker designs to resist rocket attack. Intelligence photos showed defensive positions being reinforced with additional concrete and covered with loose debris meant to trigger premature warhead detonation. The adaptations revealed how seriously Japanese commanders took the rocket threat, but Parker would discover that even improved fortifications remained vulnerable to weapons that could penetrate before exploding. The morning strike targeted a complex of bunkers that defended a critical crossroads behind Japanese lines. The positions had to be neutralized before Marine armor could advance, and conventional artillery had failed to significantly damage the fortifications. Parker led a six-plane formation against the target, coordinating their attacks to place simultaneous rocket strikes across the entire defensive network. The concentrated bombardment overwhelmed Japanese anti-aircraft defenses while delivering enough explosive force to collapse the interconnected bunker system. Within 5 minutes, the defensive position that had been expected to delay the Marine advance for days was reduced to smoking craters. The fifth morning brought revelation that would forever alter Parker's understanding of what his rockets had accomplished. Intelligence officers summoned him to a briefing room where reconnaissance photographs covered an entire wall. Captain David Morrison from Marine Intelligence explained that each bunker complex Parker destroyed represented months of engineering work. Japanese military doctrine for defending Okinawa had been built entirely around the assumption that their bunker networks would delay American advances long enough for diplomatic negotiations to end the war favorably. The rockets had demolished those assumptions in less than a week. Morrison's briefing included intercepted Japanese communications revealing psychological devastation the rocket attacks had caused. Enemy commanders described the weapons as unstoppable, reporting that no fortification could withstand the penetrating warheads. Several Japanese units requested permission to retreat rather than man bunkers they believed were death traps. What stunned Parker most was learning that nobody in American command had predicted the rocket's effectiveness. The weapons had been issued from desperation, not confidence. Commander Walsh admitted he had expected modest results at best. Instead, the weapons achieved near 90% success rates against hardened targets. Morrison explained that intelligence assessments of Japan's home island defenses had been based on fortification densities similar to Okinawa. If rockets could neutralize those defenses as effectively, projected casualties for invading Japan would need dramatic revision. What had been estimated as potentially over 1 million American casualties might be reduced by hundreds of thousands through rocket-armed close air support. Parker struggled to process the implications. His morning attacks against bunkers had been focused entirely on immediate tactical objectives, protecting Marines advancing against specific positions. He hadn't considered that those individual strikes were collectively demolishing Japan's entire defensive strategy. The weight of that realization was crushing. The afternoon brought a demonstration mission unlike any Parker had flown. Admiral Chester Nimitz would observe the strike from a command ship, watching rocket-armed Corsairs attack a massive bunker complex that conventional naval bombardment had failed to neutralize. Parker would lead the demonstration, a responsibility that felt crushing given who would be watching and what depended on the outcome. The attack proceeded with textbook precision. Within 90 seconds, the massive fortification that had survived weeks of naval bombardment was collapsing under concentrated rocket fire. Commander Walsh relayed that Admiral Nimitz had witnessed the entire attack and was requesting immediate debriefing. The Admiral questioned Parker with precise technical focus about rocket accuracy, reliability issues, and training requirements. His final question cut to the strategic heart of everything. Nimitz asked directly whether Parker believed rocket-armed close air support could reduce American casualties during an invasion of Japan's home islands to politically sustainable levels. Parker responded honestly that rockets could neutralize fortifications effectively, but strategic success required systematic application on a scale that didn't yet exist. Nimitz thanked Parker and dismissed him. Commander Walsh later explained that the Admiral had already sent orders requesting immediate expansion of rocket production and accelerated training programs. The demonstration strike had accomplished its purpose. The week's operations concluded with statistics that seemed impossible. Parker had flown 32 combat missions, expended 256 rockets, and participated in destroying over 180 fortified positions. Marine commanders credited his squadron's rocket strikes with enabling advances that would have otherwise required months of costly infantry assaults. The lives saved couldn't be precisely calculated, but estimates ranged into thousands. Parker had discovered that military aviation's purpose extended beyond defeating enemy aircraft. He found meaning in using his skills to protect men advancing against defended positions. The romantic notion of aerial combat had been replaced by something more substantial, the knowledge that his competence directly influenced whether fellow servicemen survived their missions. Intelligence reports revealed the full strategic impact. Japanese forces were withdrawing from primary defensive lines, abandoning fortified positions that had cost months to construct. The psychological impact had achieved what months of conventional bombardment had failed to accomplish, breaking Japanese confidence that their fortifications could withstand American firepower. May brought orders directing Parker's squadron to prepare for operations supporting potential invasion of Japan itself. The scale of planned operations dwarfed anything he had experienced. Intelligence estimates suggested Japan had constructed over 50,000 fortified positions defending likely invasion beaches. But history would take a different turn. The atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945 ended the war before the planned invasion. Parker would never know if his rockets could have reduced casualties on the scale strategic planners had projected. What he did know was that for 1 week on Okinawa, he and his fellow pilots had transformed close air support doctrine through weapons nobody believed would work. The F4U Corsair rockets that Japan never expected to blast bunkers open had done exactly that, changing not just battles but the mathematics of modern warfare itself. Parker returned home to Montana carrying knowledge that sometimes the most important military innovations emerge not from laboratories but from desperate pilots willing to trust untested weapons when lives hang in the balance. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.